Good afternoon. I'm Malcolm Clemens Young, Dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, California. Thanks for coming to the Forum's spring season. In her book, Jesus for Everyone, Not Just Christians, renowned biblical scholar and author Amy-Jill Levine uses stories told by and about Jesus to address the issues dividing us today: economics, family values, the legacy of slavery, nationalism, healthcare, and politics. Dr. Levine is the Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, University Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies Emerita, and Mary Jane Worthen Professor of Jewish Studies Emerita at Vanderbilt. She is the first Jew to teach at Rome's Pontifical Biblical Institute and the recipient of the 2023 Hubert Walter Award for her interfaith cooperation, awarded by the Archbishop of Canterbury. She's the author of many books, including The Misunderstood Jew and Short Stories by Jesus, and she is the co-editor of the Jewish Annotated New Testament. Today, we're going to be talking about why Jesus' historic and cultural influence makes him fascinating, provocative, and relevant for everyone, not just Christians. AJ, thanks so much for joining me today. What a pleasure it is to have you.
I felt really important when you were listing all that stuff. That's great.
Well, we were joking when in the middle, I've been ordained 30 years. So in the middle third, so the 10 years after I'd been ordained, I was the rector of this church, and the other priest was my parents' age, but had only been ordained for like 2 years. But we had your films on the teaching company, and he was your biggest fan ever.
Cool.
He died a few years ago, but it would give him so much joy to know that the two of us were talking together about the Bible. He enjoyed those lectures so much.
Well, thanks for the kind word. When the teaching company originally came after me, this is for the Great Lecture Series.
Yeah.
I'm basically a New Testament scholar, but their marketing people didn't think they could market a New Testament series with a woman whose last name is Levine, who attends an Orthodox synagogue. So they said, "Can you do Old Testament?" And I said, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, I can."
Yeah, and that was just the start for him. He followed every. As a matter of fact, I got his. This is his the Jewish Annotated Bible, New Testament. I love using this for when I'm writing sermons.
Yeah, so that's the first edition. You need the second edition.
Yeah, well, that's good.
Yeah.
Now I'm good. I'll trade this in. Although it has so much sentimental value because it was my friend's actual. So I'll find little pages that has his pencil marks in it. That it'll be hard to let go of those. So tell me a little bit about how you came to be the person that you are. Like, maybe you can talk a little bit about your teachers, but how did you, I mean, it seems so natural, your career path, but how did you become a New Testament scholar, just from your early childhood, and how do you begin interested in it?
Yeah, my mother wanted me to be a lawyer. She said, "You have a brain and a mouth. You might as well put it to use and make some money in the process." I grew up in a neighborhood that was predominantly Portuguese, Roman Catholic, right on the coast, southeastern coast of Massachusetts. And I was fascinated with my neighbors' traditions, whether it was, saints through the streets or stuff about the Virgin Mary, Christmas and Easter. I mean, what's not to like? My parents told me that Christianity, which to me meant Catholicism, was very much like Judaism. Like, we worship the same God, the one who created heaven and earth, and we pray the same prayers like the Psalms, and we read the same books like Genesis or Isaiah. I had spent a lot of time in my friends' homes, and I knew I've seen Christian Bibles, and I thought Christians had to work harder because they had bigger Bibles. I was desperate to make my first Holy Communion. I had no idea what it was, but I wanted the dress with the veil. And the closest I came to that was my mother bought my Barbie doll a bride dress. I used to practice giving communion to Barbie with nickel wafers. I don't even know if they still make them. And then that same year, when I was 7 years old, a little girl said to me on the school bus, "You killed our Lord." Right. And I said, "I did not kill anybody, because if you killed somebody, you would know." Yeah. And she said, "Yes, you did. Our priest said so." So I didn't know from Episcopalians, but I knew that Catholic priests had to wear these special collars. At the time, it was like the Nehru jacket. So it was actually a little bit of a style move. And I thought, which is actually a good idea, I thought the reason priests had to wear these collars was because were the priest to tell a lie, the collar would choke the priest. I think this is a splendid idea. So I said, "Is the priest dead?" Because this had to be such a whopper of a lie. The priest would have died. And she said no. So I, being a rational child, think, the priest said I'm responsible for the death of God. The collar doesn't kill the priest. Therefore, by the transitive property of deicide, I must be guilty of killing God. I get off the school bus. I'm crying. I mean, I remember this to this day. I'm crying. My mother meets me at the bus, early 1960s, and says, "Why are you crying?" I said, "I killed God." She assured me that God was doing just fine, which, to my 7-year-old heart was very, very good news. I found out later she made a few phone calls. I couldn't figure out how this tradition that had, the bunny and the Santa and a Jewish guy named Jesus and the same God and the same books was saying horrible things about me. So I announced to my parents that I was going to go to religious education class. We all went to public school. So it was after school. I was going to go to religious education class with my friends. I was going to find out where this hateful teaching came from, and I'm going to stop it.
Yeah.
So I'm 7 years old, and I'm going to end anti-Semitism. I had fabulous parents, and my mother said to me, as long as you remember who you are, go, you might learn something. It's good to know about other people's religious traditions. So I went, and I fell in love with the stories. Because the stories that I was hearing sounded like the stories I was hearing in the synagogue, but they all went kind of wonky. Like Jesus meets a woman at a well and they talk about marriage. And I think, okay, they're going to get married. And then she turns to be like the ideal Jewish virgin. So that didn't go the way I thought. But I'm already interested in the story. I didn't hear anything that struck me as anti-Jewish. I just don't think that my teachers read in an anti-Jewish manner. So when I finally, years later, sat down and actually read the New Testament, I realized where that priest had got the idea of the Jews killed Jesus, because there are passages that say that and surely hint at it. Yeah. But there were two other things that occurred to me. The first was that everything that I was reading was Jewish history. The only Pharisee from whom we have written records is Paul of Tarsus. The first person in literature ever called rabbi is Jesus of Nazareth. If I want to know about Jewish women's lives in the Galilee, the New Testament is the best source that I've got. So I thought, this is Jewish history that I wasn't getting in the synagogue, and I wanted to know more. And the second thing was we choose how to read. So at the time, I did not have the language for it. Today, we would call this hermeneutics, like interpretation. Yeah. And I thought, okay, so we can read the New Testament and come out as anti-Semitic, or we can read the New Testament that's come out as thinking Judaism kind of interesting and Jesus is a Jew. Yeah. And I wanted to know what that mechanism was that turned off the hateful switch and turned on the compassionate switch. And I thought, if somebody can teach me how to do this, I want to study this to learn more about my own history and to learn more about compassionate and generous readings. And if that doesn't work, I'll go to law school. Yeah, so I'm almost.
I think your calling as a child has been utterly successful. I think
it is indeed.
If you look across the landscape of American religious life, I mean, you've made a tremendous contribution in terms of our understanding of Jesus as a Jew, our understanding of what Judaism and Christianity are, our understanding of how women and men related with one another. I think that's one of the things I most admire about your work, is that I think there are a lot of theologians doing amazing work, but it's not getting communicated to normal people. Ordinary people are not, aren't reading their books and aren't part of that conversation. But I think ordinary people really are, getting the message from you about, what the first century was like. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just how the Bible might look different to you now than it may have like 40 years ago. Like, I have old friends who've over years and years of reading these texts have come to develop certain stories, like certain interpretations of particular stories over time. And those are different than how they first interpreted them. Maybe you could talk about just how it looks different to you now after all these years.
Yeah. When I first started reading this material, I thought, this is really Jewish. And certain things did not make sense from a Jewish context. So I thought, well, that's a little weird. And then I went off to college and I went to graduate school in New Testament. And I was hearing all this stuff, especially about Paul, how Paul had rejected Judaism and that the problem was Judaism, whether it was ethnocentrism or legalism or whatnot. There was something wrong with Judaism. And when I was studying Gospels, the books that I was reading were saying things like, first century Judaism was ossified and the Pharisees were horrible. And I, there was a part of me that thought, that's probably not right. But then again, all these people with PhDs who were my professors didn't see anything wrong with this stuff. I mean, they didn't bother to tell me that some of the books I was taking out of, say, the Duke University Library happened to be written by Nazis. Like, that just never managed to get mentioned. And finally, I had one of those like aha moments, like it can't be that bad. Today, we would call that the hermeneutics of suspicion. But my view was, what? can't be. And then I started asking the right questions, like, how do you know that? You, Mr. So, I was always Mr. So-and-so, who wrote this book. And I started going back and looking at the primary sources and finding out that all this stuff was part of some sort of Christian imaginary about what they thought first century Judaism was, rather than what the Jewish sources actually were saying.
Yeah.
So I basically had to regroup. And when I look back to some of my earlier publications, I wrote my dissertation, I wrote in 1984.
Yeah.
So when I look back at some of the stuff that I wrote in 1984 and 1985, it was still infected by some of this normative study that today, however many years after that it is, we realize is based in Christian apologetic and not in good history.
Yeah. And I mean, just as somebody who leads Bible study classes, I still hear these things. And they're things that there are ways of looking at the Bible that no one in my world has looked at the Bible in that way for decades. And yet they have a lasting power that constantly surprises me to hear kind of these same old tropes repeated over and over again.
Because it preaches really well. So if you get into the pulpit and you can say first century Judaism, I mean, you probably have to put it in a more polite way, but first century Judaism really sucked. And then Jesus comes along and undoes this whole toxic environment. People come out going, oh, thank God we're not like Jews. And they have a happy message and they can front load Jesus and everybody's happy.
Yeah.
And they miss Jesus' own Jewish contextualization. They miss what actually makes him interesting.
Yeah.
They yank him out of his own context and they wind up becoming kind of nice anti-Semites.
Yeah, right. Like mild anti-Semites.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that's interesting to me is it's like a further development of historical critical study. This is just the last chapter of it. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just the whole field of historical critical study of the Bible and just kind of give us a quick overview of that and just, you know, where this part of the movement sits.
Well, I mean, I can start in the 18th century and move up, but that's probably not quite what your listeners want.
I don't mind. I'm interested in the 18th century.
It's kind of an Enlightenment product where historical critical studies was in part a reaction to the theological domination of churches, both Protestant and Catholic, and saying rather than have the clergy or the hierarchy tell us what to believe, we ought to do this ourselves and go back and do the work. But the original historical critics didn't escape their own theological presuppositions, which was bad Judaism, good Jesus. They just reframed it. Following World War II, where everything kind of fell apart, there was a greater concern starting in the 1960s. It took a good 20 years after the Shoah to say, wait a minute, what actually do we know about that first century Jewish context and how do we move on? And through the major work of people like E.P. Sanders, his book, Paul and Palestinian Judaism. Today, we won't use the term Palestinian, we probably have to say Paul and Galilean and Judean Judaism. What do we know from the Jewish sources, and how have those sources been either ignored or deformed in order to get a Jesus who's over against or a Paul who's over against rather than embedded within? So there was a time like 10, 15 years ago when most New Testament studies was historically critically oriented. Like, what do we know about the Pharisees from what we can find from the Dead Sea Scrolls or rabbinic literature or Josephus, a first century historian? What do we know about the time from archaeology? How do we know, what do we know about how Rome ran its colonies? So what do we know about groups that are under Roman control, whether directly occupied like Judea or with a client king up in the Galilee? But what's happening in many sections of historical critical studies today, or at least biblical studies today, is scholarship has taken a turn more toward what does this text mean to me in my own subject position or my own social location, which is really important because you can't get into the pulpit and say, and you should live like somebody who lived in the first century. That doesn't work.
Yeah.
And much of historical critical studies was not objective because we determine as historians, what are the questions we're going to ask and how are we going to answer them and what information are we going to use? What data will we draw to collect them? So we're all biased. And critics correctly said, gee, historical studies is not objective, and you may be imposing your own particular views, imperialist views, colonialist views, white supremacist views, whatever, on your historical work. Absolutely correct. What's happened is in some parts of biblical studies, we've overcorrected. So history is in some small sectors, but that's growing, not even considered important anymore. because the whole historical critical enterprise was invented by a bunch of German Protestant white supremacists.
Yeah.
Probably also anti-Semitic and homophobic.
Right.
So the whole discipline has more or less come under erasure. I have had students say to me, why do I need to know history? The only thing that's important is what the text means to me. To which I responded, yes, that's very important. But the fact is you don't need to be in a graduate program in order to get there. Or if you don't do the history, basically what you're doing is colonizing the text. And they did not like the use of that word. You're pulling out of it stuff that you think is helpful. You're denying its indigeneity. You're denying the concerns of the people who originally wrote it. So you're basically strip mining it. And my students didn't like that, but that's kind of what it is. So what I want to see in biblical studies is good historical critical research, because if we get Judaism wrong, we're going to get Jesus wrong. And if we get Judaism wrong, we're going to get Paul wrong. Meeting contemporary concerns. And sometimes we may come up with something in the text that we, in fact, don't like. For example, many people find offensive Jesus' idea that you have to be enslaved to other people.
Right. The slavery chapter and Jesus for everyone. Yeah.
Right. I mean, if Jesus had said slavery bad, which other people at the time did, he could have.
Yeah.
That would have been great.
Yeah.
So if we find something that might set us the wrong way or think, but that's not good, then we behave like the etymology of Israel. The word Israel traditionally, the etymology is problematic, but traditionally it means somebody who wrestles with God.
Right.
So how do you wrestle with God? You take a text that you don't like and say, I got to wrestle with this because I'm not real happy about slaves be obedient to your masters, or women should be silent in the churches. They're not allowed.
Canaanite woman and all those stories.
Right. Or with the Canaanite woman, who I really like. She's in Matthew chapter 15. She's a retread of Mark 7, Syrophoenician woman. To say, well, if we actually know the literary conventions on which this story depends, then we've got really good information on how to deal with prejudice and how to deal with people who have and people who don't have, and how to keep the conversation going, and how to avoid violence. And we don't wind up imposing on this text not only anachronistic views, but views that also wind up giving us like a really bad Judaism and a Jesus who breaks free of Jewish ethnocentrism.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been thinking, there's been so much social change in the last month and a half, just with policies towards immigration, with our understanding of science and knowledge in the government, even just, having, green card holders who are participating in protests being arrested illegally. There's been so much change, just the end of USAID, the Department of Education. I wonder all this is just kind of the grist for the mill for biblical scholars, but, how do you see this as a biblical scholar, it just influencing just kind of the topics that people are going to be talking about, like say at, the Society of Biblical Literature this fall? Yeah.
Well, in Mark 12, a scribe is listening to Jesus teach in the temple, and Jesus gets off some brilliant answers. By the way, I think Jesus went through media training because people ask him questions, and he tends to answer the question that he wants to answer rather than directly the question that gets asked. I think that's quite good. So he's impressed with Jesus' responses, and he comes up, he asks a very legitimate question. There are 613 commandments, which is the most important. And Jews had been debating this, and they come up with different answers. So Jesus, he doesn't give one, he gives two, right? Because heaven forbid he just answer the question directly. So he cites Deuteronomy chapter 6, which is love the Lord your God. And he cites Leviticus 19, which is you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, in Jewish thought, when somebody cites a text, we kind of look at what comes before and what comes after, because texts are part of a larger whole. And in the synagogue to this day, when we read a passage, we just don't read like a paragraph. We read like a couple of pages, right? As opposed to like a lectionary reading. The problem with Christians is you got a bigger Bible, you got too much to cover. So you got
everything's got to be short.
Besides which, your services go for an hour and ours go for about 3.5. So we've got the. If you move on a little bit in Leviticus to Leviticus 19:34, it says, "You shall love the ger." Sometimes translated stranger or alien, but I think migrant is probably a good term, like the not native born. You shall love the ger because you were gerim, migrant strangers in the land of Egypt. In other words, you love your neighbor because your neighbor's like you. You share the same values. You share the same ethnicity. You live in the same neighborhood. You're raised in the same way. But you have to love the stranger or the migrant or the immigrant Not because you're the same, but because you had that same experience. You knew what it was like. So the first, love neighbor, is based on identity. The second is based in experience. Now, here's what I think goes wonky with Christianity. Much as I like Christianity, every once in a while, it helps to know that Jewish context.
Yeah.
Although in Matthew's parable of the sheep and the goats, it's Matthew 25. By the way, I tell my friends who don't know this, if like there's a sheep line and a goat line in heaven, get into the sheep line. Just don't ask any questions. Get into the sheep
All right.
line. Where Jesus says, "I was a stranger and you welcomed me." I think that's important, and that means I was not a fellow Jew, right? I was not part of your community, but you welcomed me anyway. But what happens in Christianity, which is a universal religion as opposed to an ethnic group, Jews are a people, we're an ethnic group, the category of stranger drops out. So in Christianity, you're either a neighbor, which means a fellow Christian, or you're a potential neighbor, which means I'm going to evangelize you, or you're an apostate, you're a heretic, you left, or you're an infidel, you're a non-believer. But in a universal religion, there's no room for the other to remain other. So I think the concern for loving the stranger or loving the migrant drops out of the idea. You have to love your neighbor, but the neighbor becomes a fellow Christian. Let's read a little bit more of Leviticus, and maybe we'd get to what God wants.
Yeah, exactly. And you're so right about just how important it is to be able to maintain our differences and yet still see the humanity and in the image of God in each other too. You know, when you were talking about Hebrew, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just biblical languages. You know, how does the New Testament look different to somebody who reads Greek? Like, what is reading Greek? How does that open up the New Testament, or how does that change one's experience of the New Testament?
This may be too strong an analogy for people, but I think of reading a text in translation as kind of like making love with your clothes on. I mean, you can do it, but you don't get quite the intimacy.
Yeah.
If you strip off those outer layers and you get back to the text as best as we have it. We don't have the autographs of anything. We've got copies of copies of copies. Yeah. And when scholars look at the Greek or look at the Hebrew, we also look at the manuscript variants, like, the official Hebrew text is this Masoretic text. But here's what the Dead Sea Scrolls say. Well, that's kind of interesting. And here's a minority view, or here's what the Syriac says, and that's a different view. Or in the Greek, here's what Codex Sinaiticus says, but here's what Codex Vaticanus says, and here's what the manuscripts say. And it gets a sense of the original fluidity of the text, which is great.
Yeah, what's remarkable to me is how much commonality there is. I mean, so I have my little New Testament right here, and yeah, I mean, it's just, so this is all the apparatus down here, but I mean, it's not that much apparatus for when you consider how much variation there could be.
Right. The basic structural outline remains the same. Yeah. So there are biblical scholars who will take that's the technical term for it, the apparatus down at the bottom with all the variant you're reading, and say, look, we don't have the original of anything. We can't trust the text. It's all fake. And I'm inclined to go in the other direction. It's remarkably consistent. And this word may change, and this word may change. But I think like the general outline of the puzzle is still the same outline, even if the picture may look a tiny bit different over here with this piece and over here with that piece.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful analogy too. It's just like how much of the outline is the same. Is the variant part just in the very middle, and then there's this huge thing on the outside of it, or is it, how expanded is it?
I mean, I think we get a pretty good sense from the Gospels of at least how people remember Jesus. Yeah. So even though we might not have the exact words, he spoke Aramaic. We're reading the Greek translation, which went through a couple of iterations before it got written down, and now we're reading that in English translation or whatever vernacular we happen to be reading in. I still think we get the basic thrust of what's going on.
Yeah, I agree. Do you have any particular words in Hebrew that you particularly love, or that are orienting words for you?
Words that I love.
Yeah.
Malafaphone means cucumber, but it's a nice term.
Oh, I love that. That's perfect. I didn't know what cucumber was.
It's a mellifluous term. There are words that keep popping up, and they do get repurposed in the New Testament. I think shalom is a very rich term, which has a sense not only of peace, but also of perfection, of completion, of greeting. It's got connections to Salem, the place, or Jerusalem. It's that same root. The word chesed, which often gets translated as loving kindness. But it's more than that. It's an effusion of care. And we kind of lose that. What we also lose in translation, and this is a choice always. When you translate something, if you have a text like the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of John, you have a Greek word. Do you translate that word the same way each time you get it? Or do you translate it differently depending upon context?
Exactly.
And I'm pretty old fashioned on this. If I have one Greek word that's used in a text, I want it translated the same way each time so I can hear that echo.
Yeah.
And since the Gospels were not originally generally read, because most people are illiterate, we only have general literacy with the rise of public education. I like the idea of public education, by the way, side note. People are hearing this stuff being read to them. And when you hear something being read, it's like listening to a symphony. I mean, you hear these motifs or these themes coming back. So you hear the same word over and over again, but sometimes it's played on the oboe and sometimes it's played on the cello. And you miss that if the words change meaning each time they're being used.
What happened this Sunday in the lectionary reading? So it was the temptation of Jesus, the devil's tempting Jesus in Luke, and says, "Here's all the kingdoms of the world, and their power and glory is all yours because they've been given to me." But it wasn't translated as the power and the glory. And so if it's not being translated as the power and glory, even though that was kind of the Greek words that were, then you miss the connection between the Lord's Prayer.
Or the doxology to the prayer.
Doxology, exactly. So there is a way in which those decisions, they matter, and you're right. When you read the Greek and Hebrew languages, then you see these connections that you might not see otherwise too.
Right. On the temptation, just as long as we're there, because I'm interested in how you take the text from antiquity and you move it up to the present. Whether we're reading Matthew's version of the temptation or Luke's, because they're slightly different in order. When Satan says to Jesus, I'll give you all this stuff, all these kingdoms in there.
Right.
Is that a bona fide offer? Right. Because Jesus could have said, "Hey, Buster, you don't own them."
Yeah.
But instead he responds to, worship the Lord your God only. I mean, whenever Satan bothers you, cite Deuteronomy. That's usually the best way out.
Deuteronomy chapter 8.
Right. Satan cites a psalm at you, which he does. Just go with Deuteronomy. It's kind of like the suit and bridge that's going to take the trick. But what does that say about kingdoms with glory, and the centers of power? And are those satanic, or are they running according to God's will? And it opens up questions of political critique, I think, in a very nice way.
Yeah, I agree. I wonder too if you can talk about some of the other languages that are important for biblical scholars. And I don't know, what your experience has been and what languages you've studied, but I think it's interesting for people to realize that it's not just learning Hebrew, Greek. It's also learning Syriac and Akkadian and learning Coptic and the other languages.
Right. And what happens in graduate school is you tend to get siphoned off into different fields. So if you're doing Old Testament, Hebrew, Bible, Tanakh, then you do Ugaritic and you do Northwest Semitic, and ideally you will do some Egyptian. And along with Hebrew, you also need Aramaic, and ideally you will learn Syriac. So the thing is, though, if you can do Hebrew, you can do Aramaic. If you can do Aramaic, you can do Syriac. So it's kind of like doing Latin languages. I mean, if you can do Latin, you can do French. If you can do French, you can do Italian, right? And then you can kind of branch off into Spanish and Portuguese. If you do New Testament, this is what they made me do. All right. So I had to do Koine Greek, but by the time I got to graduate school, I had already had classical Greek as an undergraduate with a little bit of Koine.
Yeah.
And I did an intensive course at Providence College in between undergraduate work at Smith College and graduate work at Duke. So I was good on the Greek. I had the classical, I had the Koine. I'm good on that. Then you have to do patristic Greek, which is like super fancy Greek with technical terms. All right, good on that. You have to do Hebrew because you have to do Tanakh, Old Testament. You have to do Aramaic because there are books in the Tanakh, and like Ezra and Nehemiah and parts of Daniel that are in Aramaic. And then you have to read like Aramaic papyri, like the Elephantine papyri and stuff like that. So you get a sense of the cultural world of Second Temple Judaism, post-exilic Judaism. And then they made us learn Coptic. So I did 2 years of Coptic. But if you can do Greek, you can do Coptic. It's kind of the same. And they made me do Syriac because it helps to look at the Peshitta. But since I already had Aramaic, I could do Syriac. You have to learn modern languages because you need them for research. And this is back before
Right.
you could put something in Google Translate. So you actually had
Yes,
to read the
learn
stuff.
French, German, and yeah,
Right.
Italian.
So we were required to pass graduate level exams in both French and German. I had French in high school, thank God. So I got through that. We did not speak German in my house. I go to graduate school. So 8 o'clock in the morning, 5 days a week for 2 semesters, I'm learning German. And I can't speak it at all. I've now got an app that helps me with conversational German. But back then it was just read. And the class had a bunch of scientists in it. So my first German sentence was Die Flüssigkeit ist farblos, the liquid is colorless. I'm not sure they get it anywhere. It's like you just read. So there's a lot of language work, but translation is always an art. And I find that when I do my own New Testament studies, or I'm studying material in the shared scripture, I'm always retranslating, but I have all my notes. So I retranslate and then I go back and say, I've actually changed this. I used to translate it this way. Now I translate it this way, in part because I've become more familiar with the text itself, in part because an article that I've just read has helped me rethink something.
I was one of the questions I had too when I was reading Jesus for Everyone is just like, what was the rule for doing those translations? I just so naturally supply the like helping words when I'm doing a translation, and you didn't do that. So how would you describe the translations that you do for things like
and
Jesus?
I know some people get really annoyed and they say, okay,
not at all. What I love about it was it made this text strange again for me.
Right,
It
exactly.
reminded me that like word order that that every time I do a translation, I'm changing the word order without even thinking. So it reminded me to pay attention to word order in a way that I don't when I'm usually doing translations.
Yeah, foreground the subject or perhaps.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to defamiliarize the text so people can start hearing it anew.
Yeah.
And what I find is because so many of my students I'm in churches, I'm probably in churches more than most Christians. But so many of people they've got this stuff in their head. They know how it goes. And if you just give it to them in a different version, they say, oh, this is why we keep having updated translations of, Augustine's Confessions just got retranslated. It's brilliant. Don Quixote just got retranslated.
I like the Rex Warner translation of Augustine's every other translation just does not work for me. I can't wait to see a new Augustine translation that I like.
So when Augustine talks about God and suddenly you get Dominus, wow, that makes a huge difference. Like,
yeah,
whoa,
it does.
That's not quite the loving, comforting God that Dominus. Okay.
Yeah.
Good translation.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that too. I mean, so as a boy, I read the Revised Standard Version, and then in college, I read the King James Version, and then almost my whole professional career has been the New Revised Standard Version, and then now there's a new Revised Standard Version, like corrected edition.
Updated edition.
What edition?
Updated
edition. That's right.
UE, updated edition.
So tell us about the difference between RSV, RNSV, and NRSV updated edition.
The changes are relatively minor. The NRSV made things much more gender inclusive than the Revised Standard Version did. So NRSV, New Revised Standard Version. Now we have gender inclusivity. So if Paul's talking to people in the congregation, instead of saying, okay, brothers or okay, men, it becomes brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
Or when Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, if your brother has something against you, so now it's your brother and sister.
Yeah.
Why? Because people who would be listening to Paul would be both men and women, and people who would be listening to Jesus would be both men and women. So there's a sense of updating on that. Some of the earlier translations included in quite unfortunate additions. For example, in Romans, the RSV talks about the Jews. You are enemies of God. What of God isn't in the text.
Yeah.
Right. And then the NRSV, I think they put that in a parenthetical remark, and it's gone completely from the NRSV updated edition. So we become much more sensitive to issues, particularly of gender inclusion. We become much more sensitive to issues of disability. So instead of talking about the leper, in the NRSV updated edition, we get the person suffering from skin disease. The Greek word is lepros. It's where we get leprosy, but it doesn't really mean Hansen's disease, right? It really means some sort of skin disease, probably like eczema or seborrhea or psoriasis. So the new translation is trying to get around some of that so-called ableist language. Some of that's all to the good, and some of it, at least for the NRSV, I think they're great missed opportunities. So the book that you showed, the Jewish Annotated New Testament. Yeah. So the first volume, this is based on the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version. First volume came out in 2011.
Yeah.
Second volume came out in 2017. And because the NRSV is going out of copyright at the end of 2025, thank you, National Council of Churches,
Yeah.
everybody now has to use, if you sell a Bible, the NRSV updated edition. So Mark Bretler, my co-editor, and I had to go through the entire annotations for the entire New Testament, plus all the back essays, and make sure our notes corresponded to the updated edition, which meant where we fussed at the NRSV translation, in some cases we don't have to fuss anymore because they fixed it.
Yeah.
And where we didn't fuss, now we do have to fuss because they added stuff in that we found to be problematic.
Right. It's interesting. So you have to change it. So that's crazy. That seems like a lot of work.
I know. Pray for me.
Oh my gosh. So, one of the things I found most helpful in Jesus for Everyone is just, you talked about just what it was like to be a woman in Jesus's time, and what the relation between what it didn't mean to be Jewish in Jesus's time. I wonder if those are the things that you think are the most important thing for people to know about as they try to interpret the Bible, or if there's something else that's more important. And maybe you can summarize just kind of your take on those two issues.
Sure. And they're related, because these women that I'm talking about, with the exception of the Canaanite lady or the Syrophoenician lady at the well who's a Samaritan, they're all Jews.
Yeah.
So the word's out there, popular in the pews and very popular in preaching and teaching, that first century women were what? Oppressed, depressed, suppressed, and repressed by Judaism. And Jesus comes along and invents feminism and, I think, the pantsuit. So Jesus then elevates women to their equal place as Genesis 1:26 would have it, that God created the male and female in the image of God. So I wish Jesus were a feminist, because that would make things easier for everybody, particularly my Christian friends, and plus I could locate it in first century Judaism, but he's not. Because if he were, 6 of the 12 would have been women, and they're
right, exactly.
Right. Now, did he have women disciples? There is a woman called a disciple in the New Testament, but for that you have to go to the book of Acts. There's a lady whose name is both Tabitha or Dorcas. She's got an Aramaic name and a Greek name, and basically she spends the text being dead until Peter resurrects her. There are clearly women who are followers of Jesus, but they don't appear to be part of the inner circle, unless somehow they've been written out. We can call the women in the New Testament like the tip of the iceberg, and say there's all this stuff buried underneath that's probably there that got written out of history. The problem is you don't know, unless you've got sonar, whether you've got an iceberg or you've got a flow.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to convince somebody who wants to take a more limited patriarchal view of the text that women are there if I can't prove that they're there, right? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it's not proof of anything either. So what do we know about Jewish women? Okay, so from the New Testament, we can confirm this with external sources. They owned their own homes. They had access to their own money. They could leave their husbands and take off after Jesus. They could appear in public and nobody faints. Like, it's a woman in public. They have freedom of travel. They show up in synagogues where they're not up in a balcony or behind a screen. They show up in the Jerusalem temple. They are not overburdened by questions of purity laws. And when Jesus does engage with women who are in states of ritual impurity, like the lady who's bleeding,
right,
doesn't do away with purity laws. He simply restores people, like the bleeding lady or the guy with skin disease, or corpses, because corpses are really, really impure. He restores them to states of ritual purity. So we have to correct this negative view of purity laws. Purity laws are ways of sanctifying the body, and they're particularly helpful in states of colonialism, because you can say, I'm not you Romans, I'm me. And I'm going to manifest that on a daily basis by engaging in my traditions, rituals, and practices. Women also served as patrons for the Jesus movement, because Jesus is healing people for free, which, by the way, teaches us that free healthcare is a miracle, right?
It is. I like that from the book.
Pay the bills, and it's women who are floating the mission. Luke tells us that at the beginning of Luke chapter 8. Their homes may have served as the basis for part of the mission. So we get a sense of that with Mary and Martha. So here's where language is important. According to Luke, I'm in Luke chapter 10 here, Martha is busy with much deaconing. Right? That's the word diakonane. It's the same word from which we get deacon. So do we translate that service? Do we translate it ministry?
Yeah.
Or do we say she was just busy? Right. The house church in Jerusalem following the crucifixion is the home of Mary, the mother of John Mark. So we can see women being very, very active in this movement, particularly as householders, independent householders, who can determine to support itinerant missionaries or people who might need, a place to stay for the night, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, just that for me, that's a common sense reading. Just the way that women have those particular roles. When you're talking about the house church, I wondered just about archaeology and what archaeological discoveries have influenced your thought on things, or is that just is your work just mostly textual?
Oh, no, I love archaeology. I wouldn't do it. I mean, you don't
have to in order to benefit from the discoveries.
No, it's on your knees in the dirt. I break a nail. I mean, I don't want to do it, but I want to read people who do, and God bless them. Right. Yeah. So what do we know? I mean, for example, just archaeology in Lower Galilee, not a huge presence of Greek in the small villages, Aramaic. Ritual baths. They just found one in Ostia, by the way.
I saw that in the newspaper. Wasn't that interesting?
I was there 2 weeks ago on site, and this is a conference in Rome, so we got to spend an afternoon in Ostia. And we're also, have you found a mikveh? Did you find a ritual bath? Well, and they knew it. They couldn't tell us.
Oh, funny.
So frustrating.
You're right there at ground zero.
And I now, because I was there and I know where it was.
Yeah.
Frustrating. So ritual baths, aniconic images, so coins without human images, because Herod Antipas knew that would annoy his Jewish population. Sabbath lamps. So these are oil lamps, which will last over the Sabbath. A lot of increasing numbers of stone vessels. This is limestone or chalkstone, which are turned on a lathe as opposed to ceramic or pottery. Why? Because chalkstone vessels don't convey impurity, but pottery can. So what we're seeing is an uptick in Jewish practice, which would make sense at the late first century before Jesus, early first century after Jesus, because that's when Rome comes in. So what do you do if you've got an external government that's either propping up your king or actually serving directly, like Pontius Pilate? You do what makes you you and makes you not them. So increasing signs of Jewish concern for acting out a Jewish lifestyle. I think that's important. There are very few pig bones in Lower Galilee, which suggests that Jesus followed Jewish dietary regulations. The closest Jesus comes to a ham sandwich are the pigs that go over the cliff in Gerasa. Right. And if Jesus declared all foods clean, like they don't have ham to buy in the first place. And if he did, there never would have been any sort of discussion in the middle of the book of Acts, chapter 15, where they have to figure out whether Gentiles need to do this stuff or not. Right. They could have said, oh, Jesus had a BLT, so we can too. Yeah. He didn't. Archaeology in terms of diaspora, like in Corinth or in Ephesus, most homes, maybe you can fit maximum 30, 40 people, and then they're packed in like sardines, except for upper classes. So when we start thinking about house churches, instead of thinking about, 100 people, 200 people, it's really quite a small gathering. Yeah. And then you can see why people are worried about, can I get in? Can I not get in? Or the wonderful story about Jesus teaching in a home, and he's told, your mother and your brothers and sisters, or if you prefer cousins, cousins, I don't have a horse in that race, or outside, and they can't get in. Or the paralyzed guy,
into this roof.
You have to open up the roof.
Yeah.
These are not large places. Right? Yeah. Oh, and then you can also see like upgrading, because in Matthew and Mark, it's a thatch roof. That would be Lower Galilee. In Luke, it's a tile roof. So like the house just, climbed another couple of degrees of taxable income. Yes. This is great. And it also shows us that the gospel writers are adapting their stories to the needs of their audience. And that's what good pastors do. That's what good rabbis do, is you take a text and you update it and you make it relevant to a new audience.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. In Jesus for Everyone, you say, I'm a historian, I'm not a theologian. I wonder if what it is that you learn from, other fields of religious studies. I mean, comparative religious studies, historical religious studies, the philosophers and theologians. Is there anything that you get from that world that helps you in yours, or are they
Um,
just so different that
yeah,
I
I'm
just
a
remember, being a student myself, and that was like one of the things that struck me the most. Because I'm not a biblical scholar person. I studied theology, and I just remember just thinking that like life in Elizabeth Schussler Firenze and Francis Firenze's house must be very interesting. Because when I took classes from him, there's like one set of rules for how to do things. When I took classes from her, it was just a totally different world.
Yeah. So my husband, who retired from Vanderbilt when I did in August of 2021, retired as professor of modern Jewish culture, and he works on primarily assimilated Jews in Francophone and Germanophone areas like
Yes,
Freud or Kafka.
right, completely. Austria.
So for us, I fall off after Constantine, and he picks up with the Enlightenment. So Christianity proper kind of falls in between.
Yeah.
Um, so I am a voracious reader. So I'm going to take anything from anybody who's going to give me some purchase onto this text. And
Yeah.
what I find in reading in a cross-disciplinary manner is sociologists or psychologists or even physicists will ask different questions. And sometimes if I can figure out what exactly they're trying to get at, then I can figure out how can I apply these particular questions to the gospel text or to Genesis or to First Kings or whatever.
Yeah.
And then I begin to see new things. So, I mean, we've gotten new insight into Jesus from things like memory studies,
Mm.
interest in mysticism, and I think Jesus was a I think he saw visions.
Yeah, me too.
How do visions function? And we know from anthropology how conversion stories are based on earlier stories. So you tell the stories based on templates that you've got. We have a better sense of how shamanism works, or folk medicine as opposed to professionalism,
Yeah.
or midwifery as opposed to the science of gynecology. So all this stuff, whether it's anthropology or history, sociology, psychology, economics, is really helpful.
Yeah.
Um, what do we know about how barter functioned and how trade functioned, and what did people do in antiquity if there was a drought and you couldn't afford to buy the seed for the next year? And we know that stuff. And then we can read the parables in light of it. So I'm going to read anything I can get my hands on. And I'm a member of a number of listservs where people talk about this stuff. And I have the option of delete, 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 or, whoa, let me spend the next half hour reading this article.
Right.
Delete, delete, delete.
Yeah. No, I can
So
completely imagine sociology, Clifford Geertz, and anthropology, definitely making a contribution to how we understand these things. You were talking too just about the kind of the state of the field. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, with so many liberal arts programs in colleges and universities being cut, and so many seminaries just dying out. How is that affecting biblical studies, and what will its implications be for future students of the Bible?
I think it's awful.
Yeah,
Um,
me too.
Religion used to be queen of the sciences, or theology was. Okay,
Yeah,
that sort of fell apart. Um, But the idea that the study of religion is not necessary for how we function today, that's ridiculous.
yeah,
We can't understand what's going on in the Middle East unless we understand something about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We can't understand what's going on in South Asia unless we understand something about Hinduism. We can't understand more broad politics in Islam unless we know the difference between a Sunni and a Shia. We can't understand what's going on with Mr. Putin unless we have a better sense of how the Russian Orthodox Church has functioned in the past and is functioning today. We can't understand native traditions unless we understand something about native spirituality, native religion, indigenous spirituality. So if we don't study religion as a discipline, it doesn't mean we have to agree with everything.
yeah,
I'm not interested in like we're looking for lowest common denominator God, or we're all climbing up the same mountain. But it certainly helps us in terms of interpersonal relations, let alone international relations. If we don't understand the Bible, then when people get up on the floor of the Senate with their floppy leather-bound King James version and say, this is what God wants, it really helps to have something better to think about. Back in the fall, I was doing a program for Episcopal priests in St. Louis, fabulous bishop out there.
And right. Dion, he's preached here. Dion is his first name, right?
Dion Johnson.
Great.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
So he invited me to. I wrote him a fan letter a couple of years ago because he sent a note out to his priest saying, "Don't do Passover seders as part of your Holy Week celebrations."
Right, I remember that. I wrote
him a fan letter, so now we're good friends.
That's great. He's great.
Other people write to rock and roll stars. I write to bishops. So a couple of people had looked at Bible for Everyone, where I say something along the lines of, instead of saying the Bible says it, I believe it. Why not say the Bible says it? Let's discuss. And one of the priests got me a bunch of bumper stickers that says the Bible says it. Let's discuss.
Right.
I think that's great. So that when people in government want to talk about biblical values, it helps to know what those biblical values in fact are. Or when people say, I'm citing what the Catholic Church teaches, then what exactly are you citing and what else does it teach? I just find that to be more honest.
Yeah. There's nothing that bugs me more than someone saying the Bible says. It's like me saying that, like, the Presidio Branch Library says something. I mean, it's just like, it's a group of different texts from different times, and different people wrote them, and different perspectives. And anyway, I'm glad. I like that. Let's discuss it. You mentioned Josephus a little bit earlier, just as another first century interpreter of religious life. How have our understandings of Josephus changed, during the course of your career? What was his life like?
Well, we have a new project led by a fellow named Steve Mason, which is retranslating all of the works of Josephus. So we're no longer relying on the old Loeb translations.
Oh, I'm glad.
And he's super smart, really, really good to work with. So what do we know about Josephus? We don't know huge amounts more about Josephus, but where the tide has turned, and this substantially given Steve Mason's work, is that when I was in graduate studies, which was back when Noah was still on the ark, Josephus was a Pharisee, and he was speaking from a Pharisaic perspective, and Mason's pretty much destroyed that. That Josephus wasn't a Pharisee. To use the British term, Pharisees in Josephus's mind have somewhat upjumped. They've gotten ahead of their station. Josephus is a priest. He's elite. And he thinks people ought to be listening to the priest, which is the hereditary class that's supposed to guide folks as they do what they do, coming off the prophet and priest Ezra, and so on. And the Pharisees, who are part of what we would call a voluntary association, and we know these from, and this is also relatively new, we know these from a lot of Greek sources as well. Like today we would have like the moose or the elk or the Knights of Columbus or something, the Masons, right? So you have these voluntary associations, and Pharisees are a voluntary association. Anybody can get in as long as you obey follow their particular rules and their particular protocol. They're not made up of elite people. They're made up of people who have like day jobs, like cobblers or porters or small income farmers and so on. They're out there, living the simple life. And Josephus is very upset because he says the people are listening to them and not the priest, and that's not what's supposed to happen. So we have a better sense of that. We have ongoing debates about what, if anything, Josephus said about Jesus, because in his Antiquities of the Jews, book 18, there's a paragraph on Jesus, which pretty much no modern scholar thinks he wrote entirely, because it proclaims Jesus to be the Christ. And nowhere else does Josephus say anything about that whatsoever. Yeah. So it looks like he said something about it. And since Josephus is preserved primarily by Christian scribes, the Christian scribes could not resist throwing a few. Wait, do
that. Just let's add this a little bit. It'll make it a better
story. Just add stuff a little bit. We have a better sense of looking at how Josephus changed his stories, right? So he writes Jewish War, and then he writes Antiquities. And if you compare War to Antiquities, the stories change. Right. Interesting. So this is Josephus engaging in his own spin control. Yeah. And then he writes his autobiography. So he got there before St. Augustine did. And boy, is he a piece of work.
I know. I guess to hear of his travels to Rome and his role in the war.
He's clearly a hero.
He's a hero, but
people didn't like him because they were jealous, and
you're right, exactly. They didn't appreciate him.
Right. And he was married 3 times, and it was always the wife's fault, which is why he got to. Oh God, I wouldn't date the man. And one the ways I assess characters in the Bible is, would I date this person? Would I let my children date this person?
Would you date Paul?
Oh, I'd go out with him.
Yeah.
I'd get nowhere. Paul, it's better to marry than to burn with passion, which is not a real strong endorsement of the marital bond. But I think he's interesting.
Yeah.
Right? So would I date somebody who's interesting? You bet. Would he have a glass of wine with me? Probably.
Yeah.
And I think we would have an interesting conversation, but he would be going on and on about Jesus. And when I would say, Paul, no, just not there, he would say, that's okay, AJ, because all Israel will be saved at that end of time moment, that eschatological moment. Yeah. So even though your heart has been hardened right now, it's okay. You're still protected. You will be, grafted fully on later on. Just give it some time, like a week from Tuesday. And then he would head off to Jerusalem with his collection, and I'd go back home to the synagogue.
What do you think, Paul? I mean, just elicits such a strong response from people. People who love Paul and people who for whom people who just find Paul very irritating. Why do you think that is?
Because Paul's very irritating.
Yeah.
He's irritating in the way that sometimes I wish he were just more clear on what he meant and what he says, so that by the time we get up to 2 Peter, the author says there's stuff in Paul that's really hard to understand. No kidding.
Yeah.
Right. So it used to be, at least in terms of Jewish reception history, that Jesus was the rabbi and the good guy, and Paul's the one who got it all mucked up. But there's it's a new branch of scholarship, sometimes called the Paul within Judaism, as opposed to Paul over against. It's not Paul and Judaism, it's Paul within Judaism, that takes seriously the idea that Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles. And if we read Paul with the idea that he's writing to Gentiles, which means not Jews, not Samaritans, he sounds a whole lot different than if we think he's writing to everybody.
Yeah.
And what happened over the centuries, starting in the 2nd century, is people forgot that he was writing just to Gentiles. They thought he was writing to everybody. So his negative comments about the law, particularly in Galatians, which are designed to keep Galatian Gentiles from converting to Judaism, become a be-all and end-all, so that any form of Jewish practice within the church was considered basically verboten or anathema or just, not good. So I've sort of made my peace with Paul. I kind of like Paul.
I do too. I just, even his boasting part of him is just, just to be able to say that out loud, all these things happened to me and more, and I was faithful.
This is also Paul who talks about, like his humility. He's one of the most boastful people I know. I know a man, whether in the body or out of the body, not caught up to the third heaven. Oh, come on, Paul.
He's probably one of the most boastful people in literature, in human literature.
In a humble way. But I mean, the guy's a genius. He's got to figure out how to market a dead and risen Jewish Messiah to a bunch of pagans. That's not an easy sell.
Yeah.
And he does it. And he goes through a lot of enormous difficulty.
Yeah, terrible stuff.
Whipping, killing, shipwreck. I mean, he does trot all this stuff out.
Yeah.
But I don't think he's exaggerating all that much. I think he had a really, really hard time doing it, and he did it because he's a firm believer. And he in effect, says, not only do I believe this, I'm going to act it.
Yeah, right.
Which is what Jesus does. Jesus never asks his followers to do what he will not do himself.
Yeah, exactly.
Very good teachers.
Yeah, very good teachers. Just kind of like the non-canonical scriptural literature. What do you say about that, and how useful it is in terms of understanding, the ancient world and understanding these other texts that we have? What is your take on those non-canonical gospels and other writings?
Yeah. Last week I was doing a talk at a beautiful congregational church in Hartford, Connecticut. And that was one of the first questions that came up.
I can imagine.
What about the texts that were omitted from the canon? And I wound up rephrasing the question, because to be omitted means you have to be in the running in the first place. And I don't think they were in the running in the first place. Yeah. So from my years of reading Coptic, which I had to do, and then studying people who continue to do it, my Coptic today is really schwach because I haven't used it in a long time. I think Thomas is reliant on the Synoptic Gospels. I don't think it's an original source for the most part, although some of that stuff that's there, it may in fact go back to Jesus. I find the non-canonical, so-called Gnostic stuff, it's a catch-all term, to be deliberately esoteric, to be designed for elite readers, philosophically inclined readers who think they're special and above everybody else. And I don't like esotericism. I like stuff that, like, as you used the term before, normal people, normal people can understand. I very much like the Apocryphal Acts, or things like the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is where you get stories about, like, Mary's childhood and how she and Joseph met.
Right.
They're just absolutely charming. And they tell us something about kind of what we might call folk tradition. What are the stories that people, sitting around the campfire late at night telling Jesus stories? What are the stories that they might tell? How did they understand these figures? How did they want to fill in the gaps? Like, what happened to the apostles? Because we only get a couple of stuff in the book of Acts. So what happened to Matthew? Where did he go? What happened to Thomas? How did he end up evangelizing all of India? Fabulous. But I don't think they get us history in the sense of this is what Mary was doing or this is what Thomas was doing. I think what they get us is church history. This is how people understood their positions, where they happened to live and how they understood where they came from. And I think all groups tell stories about where they came from, and some of it's true. And some of it's a little massage, like how Americans have been telling until recently our children's stories about that first Thanksgiving.
Right, exactly.
Right. Yeah. Or how the Pilgrims wrote back and said, you know what, everything here is just fabulous. You should come. It's terrific. Yeah. So it's marketing. So how do we understand those stories? I find those helpful. And I wish more people knew them.
Yeah, I feel the same way. And we're so lucky to live in an era where it's available to us, where, if 400 years ago, we would know nothing about those pieces of writing. Am I hearing church bells in the back? You are. I heard your alarm go off over there too. And I know that you have to get to your next meeting, but AJ, what a gift it's been to spend this time with you. I feel like I have 150 more questions for you. And I hope that we have a chance to be able to continue our conversation at some other future date. But what a gift it's been to spend this afternoon, this rainy day with you. Really, really glad to see you. And then for everyone else who's watching, please join us on Sunday, March 23rd at 9:30 a.m. when our guest will be Tom Steyer. We'll be talking about his new book, Cheaper, Faster, Better: How We'll Win the Climate War. And I encourage everyone to look for Amy-Jill Levine's books, Jesus for Everyone, The Bible Without Jesus, and I have a whole stack here, which it would take us too long to go look through. And we're very grateful that you could come. Thanks, everybody, for watching. And AJ, thank you so much for taking this time and helping us to see things in this new way. Thanks for a great conversation. I look forward to the next one. Yeah, me too. All right, take care, everybody. Good night.